Welcome back. I'm Bill. I bet you can guess what we're going to talk about in this video. That's right, Ashe Flash. I have had so many requests for this video and I've been putting it off for a very long time because I keep thinking, oh, I want this subtype and that subtype so I can have all of them here. I want this stove and that stove. The information is so spotty on this company, and there are things that I know, things I've heard from reliable sources, but I wanted to get my hands on the actual paperwork myself, and it's just never happened. But I just finally decided I'm going to make this video. I've got enough information to talk about this. There's a lot of misinformation that goes around on the internet, and I'm hoping I can clear that up, and hoping I'm not introducing anything new that's misinformation. They made both gasoline and propane products, and just up front I'll say I'm not going to get into the propane stuff here. They're very common, at least here in Canada, but I'm just going to focus on the gasoline products, the lanterns and the stoves. So Ashe Flash. Ashe Flash started probably around 1950, maybe even a little bit earlier. What they were mostly known for in the 1950s was flashlights. This is an Ashe Flash flashlight. They made various flashlights. Here's another one that they called Flashy. They sold batteries under their name. I don't know that they actually made the batteries, but they sold Ashe Flash batteries. They sold various flashlight-like products or things that were derivative from their flashlights, like this. Then in the 1960s, they branched out into lanterns. I don't think the stoves came until a little bit later, but that's where the Ashe Flash story merges with the story of Union Metalworks, or Unimet. That's another company that made lanterns in Hong Kong, just like Ashe Flash. Ashe Flash was based in Connecticut and had a factory or a warehouse assembly plant, something like that, in New York. But their products were produced at a factory in Hong Kong. Now, Unimet started out in 1936. There was a general who was in charge of the Guangdong province, and when that fell to the communists, he fled to Hong Kong and teamed up with another family there, and they started the Union Bicycle Works, and they made steel bicycles in Hong Kong. And they did that through World War II, and in the mid to late 40s, they restructured their company and quit making bicycles, and instead they started making kerosene lanterns, stoves, and water heaters, mostly under the name Solar. In fact, later you'll see that name Solar trademarked by Ashe Flash after they bought out Unimet. Unimet, the dating on these is not real certain, probably 1960s, probably back into the 50s. What we know with Unimet is they did get into gasoline lanterns. And I think it's safe to say that the first were J.C. Higgins lanterns like this. They made these for Sears. I don't know that these Unimet made ones were sold by Sears Roebuck, but they were sold by Simpson Sears here in Canada. They're pretty rare. And they're clones of AGM because, of course, the AGM made versions. In fact, they had the same model numbers and everything. I'm doing a video on those parallel with this. They were the ones made by AGM were blue. These were green, but they're exactly the same. So Unimet had that AGM design, and oh, what's interesting? After they quit making them with this design for Sears, guess what? Unimet starts making them for themselves, and these were sold under the Unimet name. There are some slight differences, and even not all the Unimet models have the same things. Like these have these the pinned bail that unscrews, which is kind of a neat feature. Not all of them are like that. Some of them are just like this. There are variations of this, but they made these, I'm guessing, from the late 50s. Or roughly 1960, I would expect, probably about the same time their contract with Sears ended, and they made these into the 1960s. Now, Ashe Flash bought out the lantern and stove division of Unimet in 1967. Unimet did continue on in the 70s and 80s. Into the 90s, they got into real estate development. They owned warehouses in Hong Kong. And actually, you can take the ferry over to the mainland, go to Vancouver, go downtown on Burrard Street, and there's a Unimet office there, and they are a significant player in the land development or real estate development business over in Vancouver. Part of their family runs a business here in British Columbia. So Unimet's still around. They don't make these anymore. So Ashe Flash bought Unimet in 1967, or at least not the whole company, but this division of it. So it's not surprising then that the very first Ashe Flash lanterns, they're green, but they look just like this, except instead of perforations up here, they have slots, similar to these slots. And all the internal workings and everything, they're basically exactly the same as this AGM clone design that Unimet was making. Trying to date these isn't easy, and I've tried to research the logos. This logo here, I'll call it the Foursquare logo. It was patented or registered in 1969, but the registration says that it was used back to 1965. So that suggests to me that the older versions with, I'll throw it up here, with what I'll call the script logo that was used prior to 1965, and that script logo is on the very earliest versions of the Ashe Flash 1010 single mantle lantern model. That suggests to me that those were made before Ashe Flash bought Union Metalworks. So that would explain why they are so similar. Why they changed the vent and put slots in instead of the little holes, I don't know. Yeah, so they may have been making Unimet may have been making the first Ashe Flash 1010s single mantle model under contract. Certainly after 1967, then it was just Ashe Flash. They were making them in that factory. And they look like this. Again, it's that same AGM clone design, but they've started to change it. And let me take this apart. If you're familiar with the AGM design, you've got an air tube here, and then there's a piece that's crimped onto it. In fact, you can see it on this guy. This piece is crimped on, and then there's an adjustable barrel that serves as a mixing chamber in there. This second generation Ashe Flash 1010 has turned it all into one piece. And we see that also in these later generations until we get up to this. Then it changes, and I'll take that apart in a minute. So this is the second generation, but it's still the same basic AGM design. Now, they made these at least up until 1976. Initially, they were shipped pre-assembled with even globes made in Hong Kong, and they were shipped to the States. They were also sold in Canada. In Canada, the company was registered as simply AFC, or the brand name they used was AFC. The company in Canada was registered as Ashe Flash Dorsey. So you might remember Dorsey, particularly as a Gen Xer, I always associate Dorsey with bicycle accessories, and the little generator that spring-loaded that you put against your rear tire and then pedal along, putting in all that extra effort just to get a little bit of glow every time you push down on the pedals from that silly headlight. So it kind of makes sense. Ashe Flash was known for flashlights, and a lot of the bike accessories they made involved things like headlights and taillights and stuff like that. In fact, one of the brands that Ashe Flash Dorsey sold in Canada was called Bike and Stuff. So anyhow, they were initially sent over from Hong Kong completely pre-assembled, and they had globes that were made in Hong Kong. Eventually, at some point, they started sending the parts over, and they were assembled in the factory in New York. They may have also been assembled in the factory in Niagara Falls, Ontario. I'm not sure about that. But considering I've looked up the address on Google Maps and Google Street View, and it looks like a fairly sizable facility, so they may very well have been doing assembly there. At some point along the line, the 1010 wasn't the only one they made. They also introduced the double mantle Model 1022. While there are a whole bunch of different versions of the 1010, there are, as far as I know, only 2 versions of the 1022. There's the other one. I'll throw up a picture here. I'm sure I've got one somewhere. I can't find it anywhere. But basically, everything's the same except the vent, and the whole thing is in dark green, and it's got the slotted vent like this guy over here. The 1010 and the 1022 by that point, the internal workings were effectively all the same. All they did was change the manifold so it could handle 2 mantles. So I'll take this off so you can see. We'll actually tear into this one in a bit. So you see now they've got an air tube on either side, and then it comes up, and on this guy it's just got a single burner tube that comes down. On this you've got 2. The generator's the same, everything else is the same. This simply has a larger base plate, and the 1022 uses the same size globe as a Coleman 220. Whereas you'll notice the big change here, they've gone from a 220 type bulge globe, they've gone to this number 4 size, corresponding to a Coleman number 4 size straight globe on this last version of the 1010. Now we know that they continued making lanterns until at least 1976. Whether they continued making them after that, I've talked with another collector who's done a lot of research into this, and he seems to think that the company either stopped making lanterns or was defunct or something like that about that time. But anecdotally, I'm hearing people saying that these were sold in places like Walmart as late as 1980. This particular one here I bought from the original owner, and he said he bought it at Woodward's over in Vancouver in either 1979 or 1980. So they were still around. So I kind of suspect maybe the company was still around and they were assembling parts, something like that, or they had a lot in their warehouse and were still shipping them out. But certainly by 79, 80, all of this was done. So I hope that gives you an idea with the lanterns. You can tell if they're American or Canadian because of the logo. If it's AFC, that's the name they were selling under in Canada. If it's Ashe Flash, unless it's an early one, if the name is Ashe Flash, it was probably sold in the US. I don't know when they started selling their products in Canada. Probably the reason why I don't have the first version of the 1010 is because they weren't selling them here yet. But they may have been using the Ashe Flash name in Canada initially before they had their own office in Niagara Falls. The company was incorporated as Dorsey Ashe Flash in 1972 in Canada. So that gives you an idea. Anything that was up here before then probably would have the name Ashe Flash on it instead of AFC. Some folks seem to think that the dark green was sold in the US and the light green was sold in Canada. I think this probably disproves that. There might be some truth to that, but clearly this was a Canadian one and it's dark green, and actually the person that I bought this from just lives down island a little ways, and I asked, did you buy this in the States? And she said, no, I don't remember where I got it, but I did buy it in Canada. So I think that's everything for the lanterns. Let me talk briefly about the stoves. This is a Ranger 3. Their first stove was simply called the Ranger, and I'll put a picture up here. You can see it on the right underneath those lanterns. This is the only picture I've been able to find. It's from another collector. These are the Ranger, the original one, is exceptionally rare. I don't think they were sold in Canada, probably just sold in the States. And so I can't tell you a whole lot about it other than they're extremely rare. Then they came out with the Ranger 2 and the Ranger 3. The Ranger 2 is propane. It looks very, very much like this. It's got a slimmer profile because they don't have to worry about the big tank, but same color scheme. same sorts of legs. The legs fold over and hold it closed and all of that. And it's a basic propane stove. The Ranger 3, which presumably was out at the same time because they're virtually identical in terms of appearance. The styling's identical, the colors are identical. The Ranger 3, it's got a really cheap stamped and crimped steel burner assembly. All of this it's basically all one piece. It's got a manifold very similar to a Coleman, and the tank itself is, in terms of operation, is exactly the same as a Coleman stove tank. Unfortunately though, all of the diameters, all of the thread pitches, everything is different except the fuel cap and maybe the fuel pump. So there really isn't anything that's interchangeable. The depth is even different. This is much shallower than a Coleman tank. So if you try to put a Coleman valve in there, even it won't screw in. The thread pitch is different. But it'll bottom out long before you get the threads to bite. So works the same as a Coleman. The valve stuck. There we go. It's got the air lever to light it just like a Coleman. The pump works just like a Coleman. So yeah, not a whole lot to say about these other than one word of warning. If you do come across these, I've come across a fair number of them, and I've only ever found one that didn't have the generator snapped off. Most people were getting rid of them, often giving them away for free, because the generator is proprietary. Like I said, everything is a different diameter or a different thread pitch than anything else, like a Coleman. So, of course, Ashe flash generators are no longer made, so you can't get a new one. But everybody I've seen who's tried to just unscrew one like you would on a Coleman, the steel is brittle and it snaps off right at the top of the threads. So I actually did take this one apart to make sure it was clean and everything, and I hit it with a propane torch and heated this joint before I took it apart, and then it came apart with no trouble. So if you ever happen to be working on one of these, get this joint good and hot before you try to take it apart, or you will snap the generator off. Other than that, again, not much to say about the stoves. They're not the greatest runners. What I found with them is unless you've got it roaring and you've got a pot on top of it to hold the heat, they tend to run orange and sooty. I've tried swapping out valves. I've got a spare generator and I tried swapping out that. I've tried playing with the adjustment up here, and no matter what you do, it just seems like they only work if you're just blasting them and have something to hold the heat down. One last thing before I go and we start tearing into this 1022, I almost forgot. There are other brands of lanterns, sort of oddball modern brands or brands from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s that pop up on the internet quite a bit, and people are always having questions about them, and many people often assume that anything that says it was made in Hong Kong is a Unimet or an Ashe flash, or even sometimes things that were made in Japan. Oh, that must be an Ashe flash, or that must be a Unimet. So sometimes yes, sometimes no. The first two I'll mention are Rinnai. Rinnai is a Japanese company. Currently they're probably best known for their tankless water heaters. They made stoves and lanterns back in the 60s and 70s. Rinnai is just Rinnai. It has no connection with Ashe flash or Unimet. The other is Duracamp. These are the lanterns that pop up periodically. The lanterns are yellow founts with brown vents, and the stoves are yellow with brown tanks. These were made by, I'll probably butcher this, but the Tanaka Mokuzai Kogyo Company in Japan. Again, no connection with Ashe flash or Unimet. Those lanterns are basically a clone of Coleman's 200. But there are several other companies that are connected here. The Ranger stoves, at least here in Canada, frequently turn up, and instead of being branded AFC, which was the Canadian division of Ashe flash, you'll see them branded Canadian Camper. Those are the same stoves made in the same factory by the same company. Those are Ashe flash. In the States, the lanterns frequently turn up. The most common alternatives alternative is Roddy. Roddy is a manufacturer of fishing tackle, and Ashe flash made lanterns for them and badged them Roddy. But those are ash flash lanterns. I think all of the ones I've seen are the 1022 model, but they're badged for Roddy. I have seen photos, I haven't seen one in person, but I have seen photos of Ash Flash 1022s badged for a company called Grandmaster. I don't know anything about that company, who owned it, where they were sold, or anything like that, but if you run across one of those, that is an Ash Flash. There may be others I'm not familiar with, but if you see, for example, what looks to all appearances to be an Ash Flash 1022 and it says made in British Hong Kong or Hong Kong British Empire, chances are it's an Ash Flash that was rebadged for that particular company. The other one is Nomad, and their color scheme was different, but if you run across those, they were sold in Australia, maybe New Zealand. That is a lantern that was made by Ash Flash as well, although they are kerosene, they're not gasoline, so the internal workings are a little bit different than on these. But again, the Nomad lanterns with their yellow color scheme, those are Ash Flash as well. So I hope that helps clarify that sort of thing, and now we'll move all this stuff aside and take one of these guys apart. All right, finally, we got through the history. We got through what is an Ash Flash and what isn't an Ash Flash. I know this is the part everybody's waiting for. Let's disassemble new in box, new old stock, whatever you want to say, unfired Ash Flash 1022 from mid to late 70s. So I don't know, am I crazy for doing it? I don't think so. I'm not going to take the valve out of the fountain. We won't go quite that far, but I'll show you everything else and you'll see what you need to see. So you notice it's got the Ash Flash used chrome instead of nickel, but everything is like an AGM. It's got an AGM style vent nut even. The one downside of these, they're perfectly decent lanterns. They run well, never had an issue with one, other than if they're left out in the weather or humidity or something like that, the chrome will rust. These go rusty a lot quicker and a lot worse than, say, a Coleman or an AGM will. So we've got our globe, and now this bolt here is what kind of holds everything together. And like I said, this is a late model, but everything's basically the same. There are just superficial differences between this late model and the earlier ones. Just take that bolt and washer off, set those aside, and now the whole burner assembly comes off. There are nuts, stop nuts on this side, and you've got a nut to tighten it here, and then you've got a plug on this side over here. I suspect that it was done this way because they were also producing a kerosene model for other markets like Australia, like the Nomad. There's another one that was sold in Australia, I didn't mention earlier, Camp something or other, that was sold by a chain of sporting goods stores down there. So I suspect if this were kerosene, this would have a regular nut like this, and this side would be unplugged, so it would get the additional oxygen. And of course, the single mantle version of this simply has one burner tube as opposed to two, and it's got a slightly smaller base plate. Now, of course, just like an AGM, like the collar comes off this way, but the generator's in the way, so we have to take the generator off first. And again, just like an AGM, it's got the big fat chunky generator. Lift that off, and you can see, well, you can't see, but it's got that same sort of, I don't know if they were using asbestos at this point in time or not still, but it's got that asbestos braided tube down the middle, although these have a brass piece. I think it's actually a spring that goes up through that. And here's our cleaning wire, and you'll notice, again, I don't know if I'll be able to zoom in here, but again, just like an AGM, They took this design right from them. It's got the notch as opposed to the hook like a Coleman. Now we can just take the collar off. And there's our valve. Again, just like the late AGM L-shaped valves with the cleaning actuator over here on the side. It's got the claw-shaped eccentric block. If we were to take this out all the way, which I'm not going to do because you all, I'm sure, have seen what a fuel and air tube looks like. These later AGM model, or the later AGM models, which Unimet was making or cloning for Sears for the Higgins. By then, AGM had switched to a Coleman-style fuel and air setup, which was operated by the knob just like on a Coleman and all that. And you didn't have to worry anymore about that issue that you had with the older AGMs, where if you didn't crank the valve all the way open, then you'd bleed all the air out. So it's got a standard fuel and air tube that if you've worked on any Coleman or later AGM, you'd be familiar with. So I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, it's basically the mid to late 50s AGM valve. Fuel cap is just like everything else. Let me take the pump off here. Even though this was the 70s, they were still using screws, which is, I find, interesting. Coleman had long since gone to the spring clip. The pump itself is basically the same as others. I think actually the way they've got a hex nut on here, and it's even got the brass spring-loaded insert in there. So again, this is pretty much just like an AGM. It's not like a Coleman. I keep saying they're not Coleman clones, they're AGM clones, because that's the design Unimet started with gasoline lanterns, was the one they got from Sears, which originated with AGM. I don't know how that worked out in terms of patent and all that, but that's how it was done. So here's our air stem threaded at the end. Now, the one thing I will show you, and again, I don't think you can see down that hole, there is a check valve down there. It's just like a Coleman or a later AGM style valve. The difference is, unlike a Coleman, there is no, our valve stem nut is loose, so we should tighten that before we light this. The check valve on these is has a hex on it, and it is a, what, 7/16? Yes, it's a 7/16. I hope it is. Trying to remember. Yes, it's a 7/16. So you'll need to get a extension. Stick it down in there, and it comes out easy as pie, just like that. And you can see it's got a little ball in there, just like the Coleman ones do. So let's tighten this up, because it's no good if that's loose. That's a little too tight. I think that'll be good. So that's as far as we're going to go. I will take the fuel cap off there. Now that's everything but the valve. So let's put it back together. It goes back together the same way it came apart. Check valve in there. And get it seated by hand. There we go. Good. Air stem in there. The air stems and the pump handles on these are kind of long. In fact, they look a little bit funny because they project out. This doesn't need any more oil, actually. It's nice and supple, and it's leaving my fingers all oily. So that's pretty cool. It's been like that in the factory for 45 years, say, sitting in the box. Yes, I do have the box here. It's in rough shape, but get those little holes lined up. Try to put these little screws back in with gloves on. That's always fun. Yeah. Let's get them on a screwdriver first. You know what? I'm done with the oily part anyways. There we go. All right, this other screw. See, even with my gloves off, I'm still fumbling this thing all over the place. Let's see. There we go. Get it started. It helps if I've got it at the right angle for me as opposed to the camera, so sorry about that. There. Now, put the collar on before the generator. Hook the generator cleaning rod in there and lower it. Make sure that our needle is good and carefully lower that. And we're good there. Now, of course, they don't make these generators anymore, but I have, in making this video, I just decided to check, and they do seem to be on eBay for a reasonable price, so there is that. That said, my philosophy with the Ashe flash lanterns is we'll get it. There's a larger hole here, so we'll line that up with the front and drop a bolt in. Again, that holds everything together. Ashe flash lanterns are common enough, and you can usually get them cheap. So I've found myself buying them for spare parts, especially if they come with a globe. These 1022s use a 220 size globe, and 1010s use a 200 bulge globe, or on the later ones, the equivalent of a Coleman number 4 globe. So let's put some mantles on this. Got some Peerless 2CHGs. They're Peerless's equivalent of Coleman number 21s. I think these are these newer ones made in India. If you've seen some of my other videos, I've only recently started using these, and they're fine once they get going. They are not as durable as the Peerless mantles used to be, but they're all right. I've just noticed, for whatever reason, they take a good little bit before they actually start burning brightly. I'm not sure why that is. I keep lighting these things up and wondering why the thing isn't very bright, only to come back 5-10 minutes, or well, 5 is probably not quite enough, 10 minutes later, say, and oh, it's running nice and bright and white. So I don't know why that is. Line up the holes here. There's the hole. There's the hole. We're all back together. So through the magic of video editing, I'll be back before you realize it, and we'll be gassed up and ready to fire up. We're back. This is gassed up. I have burned in the mantles and pulled out the manual here. You see it's got this same model 1022 on the front. It's kind of funny though, because inside it's got the older version, but all of the internal workings are the same. It's just the vent basically that's different in the color. So this says to pump in 35 to 40 strokes and then light it. Obviously turn a quarter turn, let it light up, and when it's burning brightly, crank the valve open all the way and add 20 more pumps. So let's do that. Right, get our flame ready. I'm going to crack the valve open first and just make sure we're getting fuel. We know we get air when we hear the hiss, but what we want is that gurgle. The gurgle indicates the fuel is getting up to the generator. Oh, and we've got it right away. So we've got it. Oh boy, and it flooded right away too. Well, sorry kids. No trouble getting fuel right away. Maybe 40 strokes was too much despite the instructions, but that's what Coleman says too, so crack it open there. Now we've got a sooty mess on the vent. That's definitely flooded. You know, people have asked me, does everything seems like it goes just right for you in your videos. Well, guess what? It doesn't always. I think we'll be okay now. Somehow it seems appropriate for its first fire up. Here it's been 45 years without any soot, any flame, or anything like that at all. They are sort of a beefy generator, so they do take a little bit more time than a Coleman to heat up. Usually not this long. It'll settle down eventually. But this is what it gets for living in a box and staying clean all these years. I think we're getting there. What do you say? Do you think it's safe to open it all the way? Let's see. I think we're good. Little bits of soot floating around. Okay. Yeah, the mantles aren't as bright as I would like, but I think they will be in a few minutes. So let's time lapse, or I'll put you on pause here, and we'll come back in a few minutes and see how things look. So I'm going to guess you probably can't tell with the camera and the lighting and all that, but it has brightened up. It's looking pretty good. This will run about as bright as a 220 or an AGM 2572 or any other double mantle. I've cleaned up some of the soot on there so it looks a little more presentable. But there you go. Let me turn the lights up. I think that looks pretty great. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope it's given you some insight into the Ashe Flash models that so many people have questions about, and maybe even some of the others that are related to it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.